Can a simple telemetry data reveal a crisis within Ferrari? What exactly did they discover in Hamilton's SF25 that stumped its engineers after qualifying in Qatar? Stay, because this story has more layers than you imagine. The sprint qualifying day at the 2025 Qatar Grand Prix witnessed an event that set off all the alarms at Ferrari. It was not an engine failure nor an accident on the track. It was something even more disturbing for an elite team. An inexplicable behavior of the car that not even its most sophisticated simulations were able to anticipate. Lewis Hamilton, Maranello's brand new star signing for this season, was left out in the first round of the sprint classification in 18th position. A result that, in itself, was already scandalous for a driver with 7 world titles. But what happened next left the engineers cold. The surprise did not come from the press or the fans, but from within the box. As soon as Hamilton got out of the car, the first thing he did was harshly point out something that only a driver with his experience can detect. The car doesn't listen to me in fast corners. It wasn't an emotional complaint. It was a technical warning. From that moment on, Ferrari poured all its resources into the analysis of the SF25. And what they discovered was as unexpected as it was worrying. Telemetry, ground sensors, onboard cameras, and simulator data began to be compared in real time. And the deeper they went, the more inconsistencies they found. There was a total disconnect between what the Maranello wind tunnel projected and what the car performed on the track. On straights, the car generated the expected aerodynamic load. But in fast corners, the car broke down. Literally. There was no visible leak, no broken spoiler, no damaged bottom. But the SF25 entered turns with radical instability. As if the front and back were uncoordinated. As if the aerodynamic flow didn't know what to stick to. This phenomenon was described by engineers as a phantom load loss. That is, in theory the car had everything necessary to maintain grip, but in practice, it did not. And this is lethal on a circuit like Losail, where high-speed corners demand absolute trust between driver and machine. The difference between cornering hard or having to lift your foot can mean 6/10. And that was exactly what cost Hamilton his qualification. But there is something more important. The car was not slow. It was unpredictable. And for a driver like Hamilton, that is the most dangerous thing you can experience. The magnitude of the problem became evident as soon as the technical analysis began. At Ferrari, data began to be crossed with an urgency unusual even by Formula One standards. There was no time to lose. In the box, laps of Hamilton and Leclerc were compared in parallel. Special attention was focused on 2 critical sectors of the Losail circuit, Turn 6 and the high-speed complex 12 to 13. Places where, if the car responds poorly, not only time is lost, the driver's integrity is put at risk. But the most serious thing came later. The team discovered that it was not a temperature variation in the tires, nor a difference in the suspension settings. Everything was within normal parameters. So what was causing it? The answer began to emerge by observing the behavior of the aerodynamic flow over the bottom of the car. In the maximum load zones, the floor of the SF25 seemed to collapse in terms of pressure. There was no break, no structural fissure. It was something more sophisticated, more treacherous. This was a localized loss of lift, an anomaly that caused an instantaneous transfer of the center of pressure to the front of the car. A displacement that completely altered the distribution of grip between axles, generating a chaotic imbalance right at the most critical moment of the turn. At that moment, all the alerts went off. Ferrari had an advanced dynamics problem on its hands. A disconnect between virtual simulations, wind tunnel data, and real behavior on the track. This, in engineering terms, is a systemic failure. It means that the correlation between the predictive models and the track has been broken. And if the wind tunnel data does not correspond to reality, then the entire basis of car development is compromised. This not only involved the adjustment of settings. It involved reconsidering the architecture of the flat bottom, revising the dynamic pressure sensors, re-evaluating the behavior of the vortex flows generated by the edges of the floor, and even investigating possible flexure zones not detected in the structural stiffness tests. In other words, an investigation was opened that ranged from computational fluid physics to on-track analyses under controlled conditions. The discovery of the aerodynamic collapse on Hamilton's car was a shock that Ferrari could not ignore. Unlike other temporary problems, this was not an isolated failure or a bad day of qualifying. It was a structural anomaly that demanded an immediate and forceful response from the technical heart of Maranello. And so they did. The first measure was to completely freeze the on-track correlation program scheduled for Saturday of the Qatar Grand Prix. The dynamic simulations of the SF25, both in software and on a test bench, were put under comprehensive review. This wasn't just to confirm the bug, it was to redraw the baseline of the technical project. If the car did not behave as the models predicted, then the entire development system from aerodynamics to race setup was, in effect, operating on a fiction. The first thing Ferrari validated was the structural state of the flat bottom. At first glance there were no deformations. But after applying deformation analysis under varying loads, with pressure sensors distributed throughout the undersurface, a slight but consistent flexing was discovered at the outer edges of the floor during fast curves. This deformation was not visible to the naked eye, but was sufficient to alter the behavior of the airflow and drastically reduce the aerodynamic load in critical conditions. Specifically, this phenomenon generated turbulence under the car that destabilized the balance between the two axles, making the SF25 unpredictable at the limit. For the aerodynamics department, this discovery was devastating. Not only because it involved redesigning key elements in the middle of the season, but because it confirmed what the technical worst-case scenarios already suggested. The SF25 had a functional defect in its aerodynamic platform concept. This loss of load could not be solved simply with adjustments to the front or rear wing. Re-engineering of the ground was required, possibly even affecting the structure of diffusers and vortex generators. Ferrari's technical management, led by Diego Tondi and with Frédéric Vasseur aware of every step, then decided to divide the work into two parallel fronts. On the one hand, emergency CFD simulations with modified parameters were initiated to evaluate short-term solution alternatives. On the other hand, the production of a new floor specification with reinforcements in the areas of greatest flexure was ordered, which could be ready in 3 Grand Prix if a viable provisional solution was not found. But the technical problems were not the only ones. This incident also had strategic ramifications. Ferrari had to decide whether to sacrifice part of its evolution program plan for the following races, including improvements to the rear diffuser and front wing, to prioritize correcting the underlying problem. It was a risky bet. If they devoted all their resources to correcting this bug, they could fall behind in the update race against McLaren, Mercedes, or Red Bull. But if they didn't, they ran the risk of the car continuing to fail on tracks similar to Losail. And at the center of all this storm was Lewis Hamilton. His signing not only represented a sporting opportunity for Ferrari, but also a political turn within Formula One. Hamilton was not just another driver. He was an icon. His arrival at the Prancing Horse had been celebrated as the beginning of a new era. But now, with the car betraying him from within, the relationship faced its first great test. The engineers knew that every lap with an unstable car erodes the confidence of any driver, even one with 7 world titles. Internally, the Maranello leadership recognized that they had arrived in Qatar blindly trusting in a model that they now knew was defective. And that didn't just affect their performance. It affected his credibility. Because if they couldn't guarantee Hamilton a stable car, the redemption narrative they had built around his signing would begin to crumble. And that, for a team like Ferrari with constant media pressure and a heavy story on its shoulders, was unacceptable. Thus began a race against time. Not only to save the season, but to save the confidence of a driver who had bet everything on a project that was now collapsing under its own technical weight. What Ferrari discovered in Lewis Hamilton's car after qualifying in Qatar was not only a performance failure. It was a crack in the trust that underpins an entire technical project. Because when a Formula One car behaves unpredictably and the wind tunnel does not anticipate it, the question is no longer just what is wrong, but what else could be failing without them even knowing it. From this discovery, fundamental doubts began to arise within the technical team. The first and most urgent: to what extent could this phenomenon of loss of aerodynamic load be repeated in other circuits on the calendar? Losail is a route with high-speed curves and a particularly demanding aerodynamic flow. But he is not the only one. Tracks such as Suzuka, Silverstone, and Spa appear on the horizon, where the dynamic demands are even greater. If the problem is not resolved in time, Ferrari could be facing a recurring pattern of instability that compromises its performance for at least a third of the calendar. Then there's the structural question. Is this a flaw unique to Hamilton's car or a systemic flaw of the SF25? If only your unit exhibits this behavior, then it could be a localized flex or millimeter deviation in the ground production, the chassis, or even the way the suspension was mounted. But if Leclerc begins to report similar symptoms as he already did in a milder way, we would be facing a conceptual problem. A failure in the aerodynamic philosophy that forces us to rethink the entire platform. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.